So let's take a look at some of the more common, most typical provisions you would see in a lease agreement. Obviously, this is probably not all the provisions. The parties can agree to pretty much anything they want to agree to as long as it's legal. So you'll typically have a lot more in a lease agreement than what we're about to go over, but these are the most common and probably necessary at a minimum that need to be addressed. And at the beginning of every lease, you got to have both the name and address of the landlord and the tenant. I'm gonna tell you, I know a lot of landlords that are managing property on their own property, which they can do that. But a lot of landlords tend to not put their address in the lease. That's probably a violation right there, because you're supposed to have the name and address of both landlord and tenant right at the beginning of the lease. And that's for obvious reasons. If the tenant has an emergency of some sort, they need to know how and where they can go get in touch with the landlord. Okay. Obviously, we got to have the address of the property, but remember, anytime we're dealing with descriptions, the property description, you never want to go with just the address. You need the tax map number, and hopefully you've even got a legal description, the lot and block and so forth. That way we know for sure this is the right property. Hopefully all three components will match the same property. Because I'm telling you, it happens where people that have lived in their homes for many years, decades even, they've always known their address to be whatever, and to find out later that that's never been the right address. They had the wrong address all along. So if you just have just the address, I'm telling you, sooner or later this is going to come back and bite you in the practice of real estate. Most leases, I would think, would have some term, an expiration date that you would put there. Obviously, you can do it as long or short as the parties would agree to, but you need to specify how long it will be. When's it going to expire? How much is the rent? How often will it be paid? Will it be monthly, weekly, whatever? That needs to be covered in the lease. And then obviously, I think most landlords will typically charge, some kind of deposit, and may have other fees like pet fees, damaged fees, you name it. They come up with all kind of fees, it seems like. But the security deposit is certainly at a minimum. You're probably going to have that. Now, why do they require these deposits, or maybe even fees? Now, first of all, what's the difference between a deposit and a fee? A deposit is something the tenant would expect to get back. Assuming they complied with the terms of the lease, they didn't tear anything up, they would expect to get any deposits back. But if it's a fee, that's just money you pay up front, and you're not getting that back. Okay. But things like security deposits, that's, the tenant will put that up as a measure of good faith. I'm going to maintain the property. I'm not going to tear it up. I'm not going to cause damage. But if you do, and things happen, that deposit, or at least some portion of it, can and will be used to fix whatever damages may have been caused. But if you have pets, it's not unusual for the landlord to charge a pet fee, because I will tell you, there's going to be some cost to cleaning up, getting the property ready to rent again after a pet's been there. I can assure you. But just stuff like that. Usually you're going to have to discuss or decide within the lease, who's paying the utilities, the light bill, the water bill, stuff like that. Is the tenant going to pay for that? or is the landlord going to pay for that? Y'all, those are pretty significant things to, y'all, there's pros and cons to either way you wanted to do this. I will tell you, y'all, whoever's paying utilities, y'all, that could have an impact on the appraisal. Y'all, if you ever have the property appraised for any reason, y'all, obviously the appraiser's going to want to take a look at the lease agreement, and part of that is to see, y'all, who's paying for the utilities. That will affect potentially, anyway, the value of the property. But the condition of the rental unit, y'all, obviously you would want to inspect the property. Y'all, if you're a tenant and or the landlord, you both need to go through together and inspect the property. Y'all, this needs to be a written inspection. Y'all, typically you would have like a sheet that says, that lists all the things you're looking at. Usually it's already something already filled or printed out. And then, if there's an issue with carpet, if they messed up the carpet, then, you would indicate that. But, you want to do these inspections before the tenant ever moves in. And what I would normally tell the tenant is, look, this is your inspection. I'm walking around with you. Any issue you see, you need to bring it to my attention so I can write that on here. Like if there's a stain in the carpet, we need to put that on there. Whatever you see. Because when you get ready or once you move out, obviously before your security deposit's returned, we're going to walk through and do another inspection. And I'm going to have the one we did on the front end and marry that up to the one we did doing right here at the end. And if I wrote up any issues on this final inspection that was not addressed in the first inspection, tenant, you're going to have to pay for that difference or whatever those damages would be. Tenants need to really be careful, make sure they don't just leave stuff out. In fact, I will tell you something else I've always done, both as a landlord and I would recommend as a tenant. I take pictures. I take a lot of pictures of every room at the before the tenant ever moves in. So now there's no question about what the condition of the property was. This is always a contention between parties at the end of a lease. Tenants always saying, well, yeah, there's damage there, but that was there before I got here. I didn't do that. And then the landlord said, no, it wasn't there before you got here. So here we go. So I'm telling you, all you can do to prove the condition of that property, the better off both parties will be. The tenant has a responsibility to make repairs and maintain the property as they stay there. When I say repairs, tenant, if you cause damage to the property, then you need to repair it, right? If you flush something down the toilet and now it's clogged and it won't flush, well, tenant, you the one put something in there that shouldn't have been there, then you need to pay a plumber to fix it, right? That should not be a landlord's responsibility if it's something you did, if you're the tenant. But tenants have a responsibility to maintain and take care of the property. Now, how does the landlord know the tenant is in fact taking care of the property? Well, from time to time, they may decide to go in and inspect the property. And obviously, the landlord can go in. But it needs to be, you got to be careful as the landlord here that what you're doing is not perceived or felt like you're harassing the tenant. That's a no-no. That's a violation. You cannot do that. But you are allowed to go in and inspect the property from time to time. Now, when can you go in? Pretty much any time, as long as you have the tenant's consent. But if you don't have their consent, there are some times that we'll talk about later But there may be some times when you can go in without their consent, like, in case of an emergency or something like that. But just be careful about how, if you're asking the tenant every single weekend to come in and inspect the property, that could be considered harassment at some point. But from time to time, if you wanted to go, hopefully the tenant will just agree and consent to let you go in and take a look at it. Usually there's going to be a provision dealing with extended absences. If the tenant's going to be out of town or on vacation for an extended period of time, then the landlord might put in there, if you're gone for over a certain number of days, then you need to notify us, let us know that you are, where you are, what's going on. Otherwise the landlord might think you've just moved out. You've abandoned the property, right? We don't want to make that mistake if that's not the case. So they'll have that provision a lot. There's usually going to be a provision that deals with the tenant's behavior. And this is primarily for legal reasons. They might put in no parties, no illegal drugs, stuff like that. Because you start having parties in there and people are drinking heavily or even doing drugs, and somebody gets hurt while they're there, then the landlord is responsible, right? So they may put in their lease that you're not allowed to do certain things, and you got to comply with that if you're the tenant. Typically, they're going to put some restriction on how many occupants can be in the property. Now I will tell you, you want to be careful about that. You don't, if you've got a 3-bedroom property, and then you say the most you can have is 3 occupants, then HUD might have an issue with that. I will tell you, HUD deems that even though this is not a law, I'm just saying, but HUD, as a matter of policy, they feel like two occupants per bedroom is realistic, is fine. So just be careful. Now, obviously, if you got a 2-bedroom house, you probably don't want 9 or 10 people living here. You probably got too many people living there at that point. So just be careful. Maybe look at what your state requirements are in terms of how many occupants can be in a property. Because you don't want to get in trouble over trying to limit too much here. Will we allow pets in the property? I will tell you, at least for me, I'm kind of out of that business at this point, at my stage in life, thank goodness. But I will tell you, when I had rental properties, my policy was there's no pets. I'm not allowing any pets. Because I know what pets do to the property. I've dealt with it too long. And I'd have 100% of tenants would tell me, well, not my dog, not my cat. They don't do this. They don't do that. They won't damage. Okay, whatever. I know better. I've dealt with it way too long. I know what it's going to cost to repair issues from pets being in the house. Now, I will tell you, if it's if you have a tenant that has a service animal, registered service animal, there are, you may not be able to deny pets, even though it's an animal. They don't really consider that a pet. They consider it a service animal. And you try to say they're not allowed, then you could be facing some discrimination complaint or charges. So again, it's important to know what your state's policies are, what their requirements are. Hopefully, maybe you have a human affairs office or department that you can contact to find out, what the requirements are in terms of pets. versus service animals. You want to certainly, you just want to be careful that you don't get yourself in trouble by limiting too much. No home businesses allowed. That's a very common provision where you might put in, this is a residential property and it's only to be used as residential. You may not conduct business out of this property. No hair salons, or what have you. Quite frankly, there are probably zoning laws that would prohibit you from running businesses out of a residential home. So again, for not only for liability purposes but for legal purposes, typically you'll see stuff in the lease that says you cannot operate business out of this property. We talked about this in a little bit earlier, talking about assigning and subletting. We know that is permissible if the landlord does not put in the lease that you can't do it. Now, if they put in there that the tenant cannot assign or sublet, then you can't do it, assuming you agreed to that. But if for whatever reason the property manager did not state that in the lease agreement, then the tenant does have the right to assign or sublet. But typically they're going to put in the lease agreement you can't do that, or at least not without their permission and so forth. A provision on the limitation of guests and how long they can stay. That is very common and with good reason. You'll have tenants say, well, this is a guest. They're just visiting. Okay, well, they've been visiting here for the last 3 months, for crying out loud. They're not a guest. They're now a tenant. They're living there, and they're not having to pay to live there. So landlords typically will put in the lease that if you're going to have overnight guests, there is a limit on how long they can stay before they must leave, or they will be treated as a tenant. And then they will also identify some of the common grounds for termination. If you do this, you're out of here. If you do this, you're out of here. You got to comply with the lease. So if you are a tenant and you don't like any of the provisions in the lease, don't rent that property. Because if you violate any provision in the lease, that's grounds for termination. They can terminate the lease and force you to leave. And you don't really want that to happen, for sure. All right, so I think those are your most common and more typical provisions in a lease agreement.